why do you think our worldview, this conservative internationalism, is having such a hard time these days? Are we, or at least it looks to me like it is. And first of all, do you agree with that? And if so, why?
Well, I don't think by nature the American people are instinctively internationalists. I think by and large they want to wake up in the morning, run their business, raise their family, go to work, enjoy their weekends. That's what people want to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. So you see many periods in our history where Americans are arguing, okay, enough is enough, let's focus on ourselves. I think you combine that with some significant domestic challenges. So you have to think about it, and it's not just the daily or monthly economic numbers, right? You have a massive economic transformation, which is changing the nature of work and business, where many of the jobs that once sustained our middle class just don't pay enough anymore. They just don't. I told someone this morning, if my parents had come in 1996 instead of 1956, there's no way that a bartender and a maid would have the same standard of living today that they had in the 70s and 80s. The jobs don't pay enough in comparison to the cost of everything from housing to the new cost of the new economy. The new economy has changed the jobs, the skills that are rewarded, the way business is transacted. It is the Industrial Revolution happening every 5 years instead of every 50, and it's incredibly disruptive. You combine that with an economic meltdown in 2008, which really impacted people whose primary investment for the future was their homes, and an ongoing kind of inability for wages to recover since that. And then they look around the world at all this chaos and uncertainty, and I think the natural instinct is to say, all this stuff just brings us grief. Let's just focus here at home. Let's bring it, if we could just sell things to each other, do business with one another, and forget about everybody else. It is a very human and natural instinct. It just doesn't work. And so the challenge that we have is to explain to people how our worldview needs to be modernized to take into account these sentiments, but ultimately, how you perform. I don't think there's ever been a period in human history where international affairs has a bigger impact on our economy than it does today.
So we need to do a better job of explaining to people how the problems of their daily life are connecting up to what we're seeing on our TV screen.
Yeah, and it's hard because it's a lot easier to say, let's walk away. It's a lot easier to say, for example, let's not. Why do we give all this money to NATO and these other people that we're protecting do not? And it's easier to say that than to explain what would happen if you didn't. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I just think it takes time. And quite frankly, to be fair, today's press that covers this process is not interested in covering any of that. The majority of what I'll say here today or any other day is covered by political reporters who are covering the horse race. What did he say to criticize the Republican nominee? What did he say to not the broader issues that I'm trying to discuss? It's all covered through the lens of the political horse race. This is not a slight on political reporters, but when political reporters cover foreign affairs, not from a policy angle, but from a political angle, what is he angling for politically? So it's become harder than ever to have this conversation.
Did you say something to criticize the Republican nominee?
No, but I might before the end of this. But my point is, it's not the purpose of it. It's how I really feel, right? But that's how it'll be covered, creates distance from so-and-so. Because at the end, they're a business. They're trying to draw ratings. And I'll be frank, if you have a 1-hour special on the importance of U.S. engagement in NATO, it's not going to have a lot of ratings. Right. But if you have a 1-hour special in which, some more exciting things happen, it'll have ratings. So I understand that part of it, I do. But at the same time, it filters into this broader conversation. Foreign policy, I'll give you a great example. Foreign policy, political reporters love to say, are you a hawk or are you a dove? I don't even know what those terms mean anymore. Right. It depends. When it comes to Canada, I'm a dove. When it comes to the Middle East, sometimes I'm more hawkish. But these are easy labels to put on someone, and it makes it easier to cover the story from a political angle, but it doesn't do service to the nuance involved in issues such as this.
When you see those big maple leafs that the Canadians have when they're in Europe, though, that does make you angry with them, doesn't it?
Actually, one of the big controversies is in the NBA playoffs. The Miami Heat are playing the Toronto Raptors, and Dwayne Wade was warming up during the Canadian national anthem the other day. He didn't do it on purpose, apparently, and so it was a big kerfuffle about that. So last night, he actually mouthed all the words to the national anthem of Canada. Pretty impressive. 40 hours, he learned it. So,
so listen, turning to the Middle East. So you've just gotten back from this trip. While you were there, did you meet with our troops?
I did. Yeah. And I think we have to take a step back. We debate policies. But the one thing we're very blessed, and I'd say this not just about our troops, but about our foreign service officers and others. When we tell our people to do something, they're going to do it. You go and tell them, take on ISIS, they're going to take on ISIS, and they're going to do it within the constraints you present them. But within those constraints, they're going to get results for you. Now, policymakers may build constraints around what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do, but they will get results. Right. I mean, there are ISIS fighters being wiped out and eliminated from the battlefield. There was another report of an airstrike that took out yet another top ISIS official. Last week I saw the open source report here today, and they're going to get results for you. So from a policy standpoint, whether it's the right decision or not is another debate, but I'm always amazed by the quality of people that serve our country in uniform and in the foreign service, by the way.
And the morale is good?
I would say so. I mean, these are not complainers by nature.
Right.
They're not people they're going to go around saying we don't like what we're doing. I think they enjoy the job they have. It was rewarding for them. If they have any policy differences, they didn't open up. A lot of curiosity about what's happening back in the States. They're watching television the same way as we all are and are curious about some of that. I wouldn't say there's poor morale, but certainly when it comes to the military, their inclination is to get the job done, and so they would like to have the ability to do more. Whether that's the right policy decision or not is debatable, but I wouldn't say morale is poor, but I certainly feel like people think like we're here to do a job, let us do our job. I get a sense of that.
Do you think that they need to be given more?
Well, that's an interesting question. What depends what country we're talking about and what more means. I think in the context of taking on ISIS, there are two separate areas that we discuss, right? And the first is in Iraq, and the fundamental challenges there involve working with local forces. And it's complex because you've got Shia militias that we will not work with, which in many cases are proxies of Iran. And then you have the Iraqi security forces, who themselves have sporadic pockets of performance. So in some areas they perform very well, in other areas not so much. Again, and so we are assisting them in that effort. But a lot of it ultimately depends on what they're willing to do on the ground. And so you'll have places where Iraqi security forces are actually pushing in and are making gains. And there are other areas where you can't get them to move. And so these are the sorts of things that ultimately handcuff us. I don't believe, and I've said this, that a massive U.S. ground force presence there is the right approach. I think locals would resist it. I still think you have the fundamental question of who's going to hold that territory once it's freed from ISIS. And I think almost immediately after that is done, you will see sectarian conflicts emerge. And so I'm not sure that that's the right approach. In terms of the number of airstrikes, look, I think we have to understand that our airstrikes are conducted under rules that try to limit destruction of property, loss of innocent life. And when you do that, it's going to be you're not going to have the massive numbers that you would in another engagement. Do I think they could do more, given more resources? Sure. I think they're limited by the resources that they have, and often by the rules of engagement as well. In Syria, it's more complicated. We don't necessarily have the same presence there. And you have vast territories controlled by multiple different groups, from Free Syrian Army elements to YPG Kurdish elements to, of course, ISIS, to the Syrian Assad regime and its surrogates. So it is basically a proxy war embedded around the axle of a radical jihadist effort.
In Iraq, the Abadi government is having some problems these days. I wonder what your view is on that.
It's the same problem they had from their inception. I think part of it is a consequence of how terrible Maliki was. It's just really a terrible leader. Really traumatized the country and drove even deeper the divisions that existed. If you go, I mean, there's a sense that after years of Sunni governance over a majority Shia, the Shias now took control and they want revenge, they want their due. And so there's this real conflict that exists between that, that continues to play out, as you saw the other day. And then even within these movements, within the Shia themselves, there's the divisions between those, for example, that are under the command of Soleimani, and others who are more nationalist, like the Sadrists, who feel like, that are more national in their view of the world, and nationalist in their view of the country. They don't necessarily want to see Iranian domination of Iraq. Then you have the Sunnis, who obviously feel under duress, going back to the Maliki days. And then you have the Kurds, who have flat out said this is the time for independence. I mean, they're never going to get, they're never going to be represented in the government the way they want to. And one of the reasons why I think they've struggled to get a quorum, I think they were supposed to try to meet yesterday, the 10th. They can't get Kurds and other legislators to come back to Baghdad because they fear for their security. So the challenges really are about whether, the fundamental challenge is really at this point, replacing ministers with technocrats, not people that basically view each of these agencies as a way to line their pocket and the pocket of their supporters. And the tensions that exist within the Shias themselves is whether the pace of reform is moving fast enough or not. So this is it's really complicated. It's like a Rubik's Cube. You get one side right, it throws the other sides off.
Is there anything that you think the United States should be doing that it's not to put the cube together?
Well, I think first and foremost it starts with security. I mean, as long as you're facing the threat of ISIS, it not only gives an excuse to Iran and others to play in the country, although they don't need much of an excuse to do so, but it's really hard to carry anything else out. You have massive territories that are still struggling. Mosul is still entirely controlled. Much of the northwestern part of the country is still in ISIS control. So I think the security element is the most important. There comes a point where we can be of assistance, but Iraq and Iraq's central government is going to have to make a decision about a way forward that allows all of its people to be represented. We haven't talked yet about the Iraqi Christians, which I met with in Rubio, both the bishop of the Chaldean church and also the archbishop of the Assyrian church, and what happens to all of them, many of whom would like to return back to their homes if those areas are liberated. Who's going to provide them the security, and what role will they play in the political future of the country, and so forth. So I know I'm not giving you a lot of answers because it's incredibly complex. I think there is a role we can play, but ultimately you've got to have some effort from the inside out that makes this happen. You know, the thing about the prime minister is a lot of people basically view him as a decent man who is kind of trying to do the right thing, but is kind of hamstrung by non-existent institutions, no political tradition of rule of law, and some pretty dramatic fracture points in the country that will take an extraordinary leader to try to bridge, if it's even possible.
Should we be doing more to compete with Iran among the Shiites in Iraq, or is that a losing?
Well, look, there's a significant component of Iraqi Shia that do not want Iran to run the country, and I think that is clear. I'm not sure that the leading Shia voices in the country. I think the bigger problem is that some of the best armed and trained militias are under Soleimani's complete control, and they're not just going to put down their arms and go away.
Right.
They're going to want to roll in their own view. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you see the administration stick strongly to this argument that everything we do has to be done through Baghdad. In essence, whether it's arming Kurds or providing more assistance to the popular mobilization militias that are not the Shia groups, it all has to be done through Baghdad. We don't want to do anything that weakens the central government for fear that a fracture could increase Iran's stature in the country. But I do still believe that within Iraq there are significant elements of the population, if not the majority, that do not want to be an Iranian puppet. But I do think if we were to pull out completely and just say let it go wherever it needs to go, that would most certainly force them into the hands of the Iranians, and they would increase their role there. So I think ensuring that we remain engaged in a significant capacity as we are now is important towards the long-term goal of ensuring that Iraq does not become a puppet state or a rump state that responds to Tehran.
I'm sure you saw the op-ed that Masroor Barzani wrote in the Washington Post calling for a Kurdish.
I think it ran like the day after I met with him. He must have written it before, though.
So what's your position on that? Should we?
Well, look, I understand his arguments. He makes a very compelling case. And I would say to you that if I were sitting in his chair, I'd make the same case he's making. And the reason why, and you press him back and say, well, you know, the administration's position is now is not the time for Kurdish independence. And his argument is now is the perfect time. It's the only time we have any leverage, because once you don't need us anymore, we've seen what happens. This has happened in the past. So I fully understand, and I don't think the concerns he raises are entirely illegitimate. When I'm overseas, I'm always reticent to take a position that runs contrary to the line that the government is following. I don't want to be in another country basically taking on the administration. At least that's a tradition we've had here, which I guess has been broken now a couple of times. But I sympathize with the arguments that he makes, and I think it's something we should be open to exploring, especially if the ability to create a unified Iraq continues to become more difficult. That said, I mean, that won't be easy either. The first argument's going to be, all right, well, but who gets the oil fields? Who gets these vast mineral reserves that are critical to the wealth of the country? There'll be massive arguments about that as well. So, but I do sympathize.
Donald Trump would say we should take them.
We should take the oil fields for ourselves, yeah. But the thing is, that's not my position. But the thing is that I sympathize with the arguments he makes. That's the argument I would make if I was in his position, and they're not illegitimate. The concerns he raises are not illegitimate. And I can tell you that Erbil is a different world from Baghdad, just in terms of the level of security and stability. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it most certainly is much more stable than what you see in Baghdad. And our alliance with the Kurds is long-standing, and I think that means something. And I don't discard the arguments he makes. I think they're legitimate, and I think that's an important decision the next president will have to make. I think the timing issue, though, is whether now is the time to do that is complicated, because to break away now would further make it difficult for the Iraqi government to carry out its mission of defeating ISIS.
We have, you mentioned before the difficulty of clearing and then holding the Sunni areas that are controlled by ISIS, and it seems that we're working through a Shiite government in the south and Kurds in the north, and the Sunni Arabs are left out. Do you have any recipe for how to bring the Sunnis in?
Well, I mean, the ISF forces are going to be the ones we hope that will make the ultimate incursion into Mosul at the right time. It could be a very apocalyptic showdown, and there is nowhere for ISIS to go. There's no easy retreat line, and there's all indications that they're willing to die, make that their last stand. And if they do, it could be just catastrophic for the city and its aftermath. There is a Kurdish area of Mosul which has to also be taken into account, and of course Mosul is the home of thousands and thousands of Christians who have had to leave. They'll have to have a future there as well. What I don't think is possible is that a Shia force could go into Mosul, take it, and hold it. I think that would be highly complicated, and in fact catastrophic, given the recent history of what's happened when Shia moved into historically Sunni areas in other parts of the country. They have sought retribution against Sunnis and other minorities in those cities, often accusing them of being collaborators and so forth. So that'll be a very interesting balancing act to see how that happens and when that advance ultimately happens here. And I know that the preparations continue. Again, I think our armed forces have been helpful strategically in trying to lay the groundwork for that. But ultimately, it's going to be on Iraqis to go in and do that work.
Nothing that we should do.
We're doing it. I mean, it's happening.
Independently of the Iraqi government.
Well, ultimately, you've got to do it in conjunction with the forces that are ultimately going to move in.
Right.
And I think the Kurds will have a part to play in terms of cutting off supply lines to ISIS. I think, believe it or not, how the Shia militia comport themselves, because there's an argument they may use this as not as an opportunity to go and take Mosul, but as an opportunity to move even further north and take other areas to the north of the country. Their argument now is that there's Turkish troops stationed up north, and so they need to go up and make sure they can counterbalance that. So they'll have a role to play somewhat in the periphery, but ultimately the responsibility of liberating Mosul will have to be in the hands of the Iraqi security forces, led primarily by Sunni forces who are able to go in and hold that territory after it's liberated.
So the president says we're going to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. What would you, if that's the goal, how would you rate our progress along that continuum?
Well, we're making progress. As I told you, the military of the United States of America, you give them a task, they're going to do it. You tell them, go out and kill ISIS fighters, they will kill ISIS fighters. They do that every day. I think you can argue with the pace of it. People would like to see more intensity, more assets committed to it. If they had more assets, they could do more aircraft in particular. But it will happen. The fundamental question, though, is radical Sunni Islam, this radicalization element. There will still be, if it's not ISIS, somebody else will step up and take their place, as long as these basic ingredients are still there. Syria is a great example of it. You can wipe ISIS out, Jabhat al-Nusra, or some other group will then rise up and take the mantle of that. And that will continue to be the case as long as Assad is in power and as long as sectarianism divides Iraq the way it does now. There will always be fertile ground for a new radical movement to emerge and to try to take advantage of it.
Let's move to Turkey. You were also in Turkey, and you mentioned that the Turks, perhaps you mentioned it in the conference from before, that the Turks are looking at this conflict through the lens of their relations with the Kurds. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the irritant in our relationship with Turkey is our relationship with the YPG, which they view as an offshoot of the PKK, and frankly, that's been a major irritant in the relationship. The U.S. position and response is there's no one else to work with in the northern part of Syria. That's why we had to work with them. So their primary challenge continues to be the PKK and its activities within Turkey. Related to it, secondarily, of course, they're worried about an increase of ISIS targeting into Turkey, which we've clearly seen an effort to terrorize. They're trying to strike at Turkey's tourist sector by hitting places where they believe Westerners congregate, and so that visitors won't visit and they can hurt the country's economy. So that's beginning to increase as a threat to them, but their fundamental challenge remains and their fundamental focus remains, their conflict with the PKK and within Turkey itself, and what they view as their allies just south of their border. Their biggest fear, of course, is that the YPG will unify all the cantons across North Syria and then establish an independent Kurdish state right on their border, and from there just extrapolate that across the border into southern Syria as well. So that's what 80% of their focus is on. But of course they have a growing concern about ISIS and its involvement in attacks in Istanbul and in Ankara recently.
This is a problem that I've lately been thinking a lot about, and frankly I find it really vexing. Because our forces on the ground are working with the Kurds in Syria, but I fully understand the concerns of the Turks, and I fully and I believe that in the long run, in terms of putting this region together, we have to be working with Turkey. So I wonder if you have any ideas about how to balance these competing commitments.
Well, look, I do think that long term, our relationship with the YPG could prove to be very, very complicated. I think that in the short term, we work with them in the north simply because that's who's there and that's who can control territory. But in the long term, I think there's the real chance that could turn into a very difficult situation for us, particularly vis-a-vis our allies in Turkey. How you put it together, look, the bottom line is that from their perspective, they've got to somehow figure their way through this issue that they have with the Kurdish representation in their own country. And in the absence of that, and with this continuing conflict against this group, the terrorist organization, as PKK is designated by the U.S. government, that's an issue that I think is going to be going for a while. I'm not sure what role we can play in it, other than ensure we're not empowering them. But they're going to have to confront that in the context of what's happening now in northern Syria, and the concern they have that if they could unify the cantons, you could create this a Kurdish state right at their border that poses an incredible threat to them in losing territory to the southern part of their own country.
Did you hear any suggestions from them? Did they have any ideas that you thought were constructive about how to balance this, or was it all just?
No, not a lot of balance. I mean, they want to wipe the PKK out militarily.
And so they say their message to us was get the hell away from the war.
Yeah, their message is we have Kurds are involved in the life of this country. They can run for they can be in office. They can participate. They're Turks. They're part of our country. But they can't have this organization that blows things up, and they can't have this organization that sets up its own independent country. We're not going to let it happen. And so they're going to continue their efforts against it. I think their primary concern is that we are empowering the YPG, which they view as simply a name change of the PKK in northern Syria, that they'll be able to unify territory and from there use it as a base of operations against their interests. And of course, the concern at that point is that you'd have an all-out war going on in northern Syria and southern Turkey, between Turkey and those elements, at the same time as all these other things are happening.
What did the Turks say to you about the fight against ISIS? Did they have any suggestions directly about?
Generally, obviously you've seen the open source reports about their increased cooperation and assistance in taking that fight on. I think it's growing in importance given some of the challenge, the strike attacks. There are always details that we can be improved on. And a lot of that we covered during the intelligence portion of my visit, but there are ways to improve upon it. But I think there's evidence that they see the growing threat of ISIS, and they're dealing with it both from a domestic standpoint and ultimately in their willingness to do more with regards to Syria. They also share this view that their primary, they view, the way I could best describe it is they view ISIS as, yeah, something we got to deal with now, but we're going to beat them. What about Assad? Right? And that's the same attitude you hear in multiple countries in the Middle East. There's not a lot of doubt that eventually ISIS is going to be defeated in terms of militarily. But then what? What comes next? And everyone's already, there was one thing that would categorize my visits is many of the players, if not all of them, they're already in the phase of thinking about what happens next.
The day after.
And positioning themselves for what happens next in terms of Iran's ambitions in the region, in terms of successors to ISIS, in terms of the Kurds when it comes to Turkey, in terms of this, how do you unify Iraq if that's even still possible, et cetera, et cetera.
So if I could, let me try to summarize what I just heard you say, and you can tell me if that's right or that's wrong. That the implications for the United States are that we have to present to the players in the region a credible picture of the order that will result from our military action in order to get the best cooperation from these players.
Yeah, so what is the national interest in the United States? Big picture national interest is we do not want ungoverned, chaotic spaces in the world where terrorist organizations can train people, raise money, control territory, and use it to plot attacks against us or our interests and our allies around the world. That's our number one overriding interest. That's why all of this matters. That's why what happens in Syria matters. The reason why it matters to the U.S. national interest is because Syria, the instability in Syria created an opening for a group, ISIS, to establish a foothold, attract foreign fighters, and now conduct external operations. The same is the concern with Iraq. Secondarily to that, or not secondarily, but associated with it, is our desire to see as much stability as possible, because these countries, as long as they're unstable, they pose a number of other threats to us in the region, including Iran's ambitions to spread, to create a sphere of influence that combines Iraq and Syria with themselves, and increasingly Lebanon, to really crowd out our allies in the region and pose the risk of escalation. But ultimately, just from a pure selfish national security interest of the United States, we want to see stability in Syria and in Iraq, because in the absence of that stability, you're going to have radicalized groups who are going to be using it to stage and conduct external operations against the United States and its interests.
So stability in Syria, do we achieve that by trying to cut a deal with the Assad regime, or should we be sitting down with the Turks and talking about how to get rid of it?
I honestly don't know how you cut a deal with the Assad regime. I don't think Assad can ever govern their people in that country again. You've seen what's happened in Aleppo just in the last week and before that. The suffering, the human suffering, isn't just heartbreaking. The practical implications of it is there are 7, 8, 9-year-old children who are going to hate Bashar al-Assad and are going to spend the rest of their lives trying to get their hands on him and the people who helped him. This is the reality of what happens when you bomb a city and you kill a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old child's mother and father and leave them orphans, destroy their homes, and steal their childhood. People don't forget this. That is never going away. That will always be there. And as long as Assad is there, Syria will be unstable. There is no way that Assad can ever govern that country again.
So,
and it'd be stable.
So let me propose a hypothetical, and bear with. Suppose that you were vice president and you were playing a role kind of like Vice President Biden plays, where he has a major role in dealing with the Turks and dealing with the Iraqis. What would you propose to the president about the way forward, for the first step in order to move against Assad?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's a difficult one at this stage, because I think it would have been a little bit easier to deal with at the front end of it. I do think we need to, and I mean front end, I mean in 2011, when I advocated that we should identify elements that we felt we could work with and empower them to become the most significant, well-equipped group on the ground. And because I warned that in the absence of that, that vacuum would be filled by other groups, and each country in that region would go their own way in terms of who to arm and train. That's kind of the direction it went. So now it's a little harder to do so. I still believe that we need to continue to empower elements that we can work with in Syria, and I believe there are elements that we can work with in Syria in a much more challenging environment, in the hopes of eventually not forcing just Assad, but forcing all those who support him to negotiate not just the exit of Assad, but the the creation of some sort of transitional authority that can decide the future of that country. And I think it's a very legitimate question to ask whether that country, as we understand its boundaries today, will ever be able to be a unified country that way again, given what's happened. Is it possible for that country to once again unify Sunnis, Shia, Christians, and others, given what's happened there, and Alawis, given what's happened there in the last 5 to 7 years? That's an open question that will ultimately have to be determined by that transitional authority that should be representative. But you're not going to get to that stage as long as Assad feels like he's winning. And after the Russian, it's interesting to note that before the Russians got engaged, Assad was losing. Now, he was losing to ISIS, but he was also losing to non-ISIS forces. And it was only after one of the reasons why the Russians engaged is because their fear that, in fact, that the regime was headed in an opposite direction. They would lose access to their warm water port. And that's when because even the Iranian involvement was not enough to sustain them. And so I think the only way you're going to get people to the table and the establishment of a credible transitional authority is to increase U.S. support for elements on the ground that can actually threaten the Assad regime and force them to a negotiated exit. But right now, after the Russian engagement in the process, the tide of that war has changed, and Assad now not only does he not see that day coming, he thinks he's going to win this thing. He thinks he's going to, even if he has to level Aleppo and everything else, he thinks he's going to win, and at a minimum, capture enough of that country to kind of take him back 10 years to where he was 10 years ago.
In a minute, I want to open it up to some questions from the audience, but let me switch gears here a little bit. And you probably saw the David Samuels piece in the New York Times Magazine about Ben Rhodes and the campaign to push the.
I kind of skimmed through it. I knew a lot of that already, but
yeah.
I kind of skimmed.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Is there anything particularly shocking here to you about this?
No, I mean, look, I don't mean to be. I've met with Ben a couple times, saw him a couple weeks ago. I don't mean to be disrespectful. He's clearly a smart and intelligent person. But I don't. When, for example, on the issue of Cuba, when you send a speechwriter to negotiate with trained intelligence officers, you usually get a bad deal. And I think that Cuba is an example of it. I think in the case of Iran, he works ultimately for the president. The president wanted a deal. They did a deal, and Ben Rhodes figured out a way to sell it to the American public. I'm not sure that's the right way to make foreign policy, but that's certainly the way the administration approached it, and you know, obviously was effective at messaging to a certain extent because he got the result they wanted. But yeah, I'm concerned about foreign policy being written as a novel as opposed to kind of what's in the long-term interest of the United States. But I made those arguments at the time.
Right.
And I made the arguments at the time that this was the deal with Iran and the deal with Cuba was more about an additional exhibit at the Obama Presidential Library than it was about some stable foreign policy that could be sustained over the long term for different reasons. In the Iranian case, any understanding of Persian history, the history of the region, leads you to conclude that at some point they will seek a preponderant position over their neighbors, and the best way to do that in the 21st century is to be a nuclear power capable of striking nations all over the world. Once you reach that point, as North Korea learned, you become immune to international pressure. There's not so much, they can't invade you, there's things they can't do to you anymore because you may hit them. And so that is, and on the issue of Cuba, it's unfortunate because I thought that we were reaching a point of incredible leverage over the Cuban regime given the disaster that is Venezuela and the subsidies that are going to stop coming to at least get some political opening vis-a-vis what you've seen begrudgingly slow, unfortunately, but with Burma. Instead, the Cuban regime's now seeking a way to institutionalize this form of government they have and leave it permanent for future generations of leaders or whatever. And I think that the Obama deal with Cuba gave away much of the leverage that we had up to that point to kind of nudge it in the direction of more democracy.
Let me just ask you one more quick question on Israel, and then we'll turn it over to the crowd here. There's a lot of talk about perhaps the United States supporting a Security Council resolution, most likely after the election, so it won't complicate Hillary Clinton's chances, that would lay out in the form of international law the parameters for Israeli-Palestinian peace I know the Israelis are concerned about this. The pro-Israel community here is concerned about it. What's your view of the likelihood of that? And do you have any ideas about how we can stop it?
Well, I don't know about the likelihood. It wouldn't surprise me. The administration has threatened it on a number of occasions, maybe not overtly, but in some of the language they've used. I don't think you can impose a solution. And quite frankly, I've said this before, I'm not sure that the conditions today exist for such a solution. I don't think they're in place. To begin with, I'm not sure Israel has a partner to negotiate with. There is no honor in the Palestinian Authority's political circles to being the person that cuts a deal with Israel for peace. I think you're negotiating in the case of, in some cases, of a unity government now with Hamas that has basically stated that their purpose is the destruction of the Jewish state and its elimination. So it's very difficult to deal with people who have stated that their goal is your destruction. So that I think is now, do I hope that there's a solution? Absolutely I do, and perhaps the conditions will exist at some point. So I think our goal now it should be, to the extent possible, to ensure that conditions are secure in that area, that the Palestinian people living in, hopefully in Gaza one day, but also in the Judea-Samaria region, the West Bank, that they're able to have some level of prosperity and security and upward mobility, and in the hopes that generationally there's some level of societal transition that will allow these people to live with an understanding that right now seems impossible, given what young children are taught at a very young age about how glorious it is to kill Israelis and Jews. And so I just don't think that at this point the conditions exist for this grand deal. And I don't think the international community can pressure Israel into it, nor do I think they should try. And in fact, I think it actually makes it worse.
Right.
Because when you try to impose these conditions, it emboldens Israel's enemies to be even more daring in their attacks and in their attitude.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's now turn it over to the audience. And there I see Nina Shea. Well, could everyone, when I call on you, if you could just quickly give your name and your affiliation, and then your question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nina Shea,
Yes.
Director of the Center for Religious Freedom here at Hudson. Thank you, Senator. 2 months ago, we saw a historic designation of genocide, of ongoing genocide, from the Secretary of State on behalf of the Christians, Yazidis, and others at the hands of ISIS. And I want to thank you for your leadership on that issue, by the way, in the Senate. But it's been disappointing that the Secretary of State has been silent ever since. And what should the next steps, next policy steps of the United States be, specifically on behalf of these ISIS survivors, specifically those in Kurdistan, Iraqis in Kurdistan? This is now dragging on to the 3rd year. They're continuing to live as indigents. They have dire needs for everything from housing to education, including college, to equal rights of citizenship, land protection, and so forth.
Well, first of all, it's important to point out that a tremendous amount of the financial burden of assisting these displaced people, particularly Christians, and also Yazidis and other religious minorities, have fallen disproportionately on Kurdistan. And they're not just giving territory, but they're actually bearing the cost of it. So I think there needs to be more international cooperation led by the U.S. example for providing this assistance. Obviously, I think the faith-based community in America and around the world has contributed, but they simply can't bring the same efforts to bear as governments can. So I think that's critical. The second reason why that's critical, and you talk to people there, is because you don't want to see everybody leave. If they do, that means you're going to basically rob the area of its historical ties. You want to see as many people as possible that have been displaced return to their ancestral communities and rebuild them. And so I think it's important to have a commitment from the Iraqi government and the governing authorities in these cities that in fact that's going to be allowed to happen, and that their security forces are going to provide that space for them. So I think the financial assistance to dealing with the international displaced people led by the United States is critical in the short term. To the extent that there are individual cases of people that want to come to the United States or to the West, that should be facilitated as well, these Christians that are seeking for reasons to leave. But I think our ultimate goal should be to keep as many as possible in the region so they can return to their ancestral homelands and feel secure and with a chance of prosperity. Within that, there are a growing number of Christians, young men and some women who aspired to join some of these popular mobilization forces. And I think that part of the long-term security, of course, is the ability for these Christian communities to feel empowered, that they have a role to play in their own self-defense. Again, this is not about arming religious militias, but by the same token, when you're the only people that aren't able to defend yourselves, you're basically at the mercy of others' willingness to assist you. So I think it's a multifaceted, but the designation was important because it calls attention to the reality of what they're facing. They're not just being evicted because bombs are going off, they're being targeted for death because of their religion. And so that designation was important. What hasn't followed is the assistance that should come with that designation, and that is the financial assistance to care for them in the short term, in the hopes not just of carrying out our humanitarian function, but also keeping as many Christians as possible in the region so they can return to their ancestral homelands and reestablish these ancient communities. We'd hate to see that eliminated. We've already, even before this conflict, saw a significant amount of Christians leaving Iraq and other parts of the region, and that would be, I think, unfortunate if that trend were to continue in the aftermath of this.
There's a gentleman in the back there who's very eager to ask a question.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your time. Rahim Rashidi with Kurdistan TV. A couple of weeks ago, you were in Kurdistan. Can you please tell us what do the Kurds need right now? And of course, you know President Barzani decided for referendum. If Kurdistan will be a state, how important is it for the stability in the region? Do you think Kurdish states should be supported by United States and allies? Thank you.
Yeah, I can tell you what I know Kurdistan wants, and that is to be more directly funded as opposed to having their defense needs have to run through Baghdad. And they make a compelling case for the need for that. You know, I have generally been someone in the past who has argued that I want to see Iraq remain unified and not partitioned. That's been my position in the past. I think that's a position that's worth re-examining given everything that's happened. I'm not prepared to say that I'm in favor of independence or whether some, you know, a more advanced confederacy type system. I don't know exactly how it would outlay, but I've already stated that after our meetings in Kurdistan, they clearly make a very compelling case for why it is that we should re-examine our position on that issue. I think the question is more one of timing, and that is the partitioning of Iraq or independence of Kurdistan at this moment, I think would really be an additional irritant to an already complicated situation and already significant challenges that Baghdad faces in terms of presenting a unified front to take on ISIS. Obviously, the Kurdish authorities argue now is the perfect time to do it because they have maximum leverage in terms of that argument. So it's an argument I'm open to be honest with you, given what I've learned on that trip. I'm not prepared to endorse it at this time, but I'm certainly open to learning more about it. And I do think, irrespective of how this conflict ends, there is no doubt that more will need to be done to ensure that the people of Kurdistan feel like they have more autonomy and a greater role to play in their own security and in their own long-term stability.
David Hazzoni.
Hi, David Hazzoni, editor of The Tower, and I work for the Israel Project. We haven't heard a lot about Israel in the context of the Syrian theater.
Of the what, I'm
of the
sorry?
Syrian conflict. Given that, from what you said, it sounds like what you're saying is we're heading towards some kind of a non-unified Syrian resolution, if there's a resolution at all. Given that there will be some kind of division, would it not make sense to also include in any resolution a recognition of Israel's presence in the Golan on a permanent basis, considering that the alternative would be almost unifying rhetorically the opponents to Israel and perpetuating conflict if we're already dividing it up, if we're already making it basically having there nobody for Israel to give the Golan Heights to, because they wouldn't give it to Alawite, Stan, Assad regime. They wouldn't give it to any of the other divisions. Wouldn't it make more sense for the U.S. to take a position that insists on including that in any kind of resolution?
I think, I've said that before. I mean, I think potentially that's exactly right. I mean, in the short term, the Golan isn't going anywhere. I mean, it is going to continue to be an important buffer for Israel, especially given what you now see on the ground. I think in the longer term, that's a position that I'm also open to. Again, what I've tried to avoid doing is add additional irritants to an already difficult issue, because it would almost give an argument. It would almost be used by some of the forces in Syria as